Hello everyone, welcome in. This is my first video for you. So my name is Ash, also known as My Name is Ash, or My Name is Mud by Ash, rather. So if you're finding me on social media or you're just happening to stumble upon my video on YouTube, welcome in. If you're one of my students, awesome. Good job. So I am going to do a demonstration. It's going to be a thorough walkthrough of how to set up your pottery wheel as well as get going on the pottery wheel. And I'm not focused on making anything specific. I'm just going through the foundations, okay? I have been throwing on the wheel for about 20 years. This is unfortunately harder than it looks, but I don't say that to intimidate anybody. I say that because I'm a firm believer in the better mentally prepared you are coming in, the higher chances of success with your results will be in the end. Now, there's quite a few reasons why this is harder than it looks. It is really fun and it can be very cathartic, but it is a good challenge. First and foremost, I'm going to walk you through how to set up your pottery wheel. So the tools I'm going to be using are basic tools from a Kemper toolkit. So I have my sponge, I have a metal rib, I have a wooden rib, a needle tool, and a wooden knife, as well as my wire tool, and then of course my ball of clay. What I also have is called a bat. It's smooth on one side, typically both sides, it depends on the kind of bat that you're using. This one has a grid pattern on the back end of it. That grid pattern is very important. As you can tell, it has two sets of holes on each side. So the narrower holes are for a smaller wheel head, okay? And along the perimeter of where those narrow holes are is a single notch, okay? Where there are 3 notches along the perimeter are wider holes for those bat pins, which are wing nuts and bolts that affix to your wheel head so that you can anchor your bat to the wheel head. So when you have your bat pins anchored to your wheel head, you want to line your fingertips up with those holes, appropriate holes. So for me, I'm using the standard, which is the 3 notches on the side. I'm going to put my fingertips over those holes, and when I feel the bat pins on the other side of my fingertips, I'm going to slide my fingertips out and anchor that bat to the wheel head. The reason why so many people use bats on their wheel head is especially if they're making more than one piece and they don't want to take their piece off of the bat right away, right after they throw their piece, okay? So it is an option if you want to throw directly on that wheel head. There's nothing wrong with that, all right? But to anchor that bat down to the wheel, that is how I do that. Now, every wheel looks very similar, but some of them have their differences. Mine is a 2-part splash pan system, so it slides away from the wheel head into 2 parts, and they snap together into place. If you turn your wheel head on and you see or hear that splash pan rattling and making an obnoxious noise, turn your wheel head off, slide the splash pan away, slide it back into place, and make sure it's on track with up underneath that wheel head so that you can sufficiently lock it together. Now on the right hand side of your wheel is a small control box with a few buttons or toggle switches, or both. You want to make sure your power switch is on. Sometimes it's a button, sometimes it is a toggle switch, and it usually lights up. So when it is lit up, you know you have power and your wheel head should spin. If it's not spinning, you have another toggle switch on that control box. That is for the direction your wheel head is spinning, and that is very important depending on how you're taught, because every side of the world teaches this differently. So what a lot of people in the US, which is where I'm located, teach, especially with that first step to throwing on the wheel, we typically teach if you are right hand dominant, you want your wheel head to spin counterclockwise, and vice versa if you're lefty, unless you do well being ambidextrous. All right, now everybody throws on the wheel differently. There is no one cookie size or cookie cutter size way to throwing on the wheel, and it's okay. That's partly why this is harder than it looks and why it is such a good challenge, all right? Because There is a lot of little variables to learn and understand and get to the point where it's best for you to do this successfully. So with that directional toggle switch on the side of your control box, if it's in the center position, it means it's a neutral position, so your wheel head's not going to spin. So you want to adjust that toggle switch so that it's either in forward or reverse. And like I said, if a lot of times, at least in the US, if you're right-handed, we typically teach for you to spin counterclockwise. I am right-handed, so I will be spinning counterclockwise. Now, you also want about a gallon of water in a bucket or a container. A lot of times, especially those who end up throwing on the wheel over a prolonged period of time and really get into this, they will choose to have a second container for the mud or the slop that they end up scraping off of their hands, okay? Because they'll reuse that for other means. Now, when you have your power on to your pottery wheel and you know you're spinning the right direction, you want to then have a ball of clay that comfortably fits in both hands, but without your fingertips and or your palms touching when you wrap your hands all the way around it. That is depending on the size of your hands. So for me, I do not have large hands at all. This is probably like 1.5 pounds of clay, maybe closer to 2 pounds. So the larger your hands are, you might want to use a little bit more clay than I am. The reason why I suggest that, especially for beginners, is because if you are using a much smaller ball of clay, when you start to apply the 3 key factors that I am going to talk a lot about, you're going to be getting a much heavier response out of that clay, because that clay is responding to you. It's mostly about your body, it's less about the clay, all right? Now, that brings me back to several more reasons why this is harder than it looks. You are learning how to intuitively respond to the clay as it responds to you, all right? So in other words, you're balancing a lot of tension, pressure, and wheel speed with each other, regardless of what step you're on, until you cut that piece off the wheel. Now, you need a lot more than what you may realize, depending on the consistency of your clay and how much clay you are working with at once. So the less clay you're using and the softer that clay is, you don't need nearly as much to balance those 3 things out: your tension, pressure, and wheel speed. So, and you don't want to start off with too little, because as soon as you start to add that tension and pressure, that clay is going to want to go flying, and it's going to be harder for you to understand and fine-tune just how much you need. So I recommend enough that comfortably fits in your hands but isn't obnoxious and closer to the size of your face. So you want to make sure that that ball of clay doesn't have any holes or a concave dip in it, especially where you're going to attach it to your wheel head, because then when you attach it to your wheel head, you're going to trap air in between the two, and it's going to make it harder for you to learn and accomplish that first step, which is the hardest step. Now, one of the other reasons why this is harder than it looks, especially if you're learning how to center, which is what the first step is called, it's called centering. If you are learning how to do this, how I'm going to teach you, all right? I am doing it by coning up and down. Not everybody teaches that method, and it's okay, it doesn't mean they're wrong. But this method teaches several things. It teaches you how to train your non-dominant arm to not only work in tandem and balance the same tension and pressure with your dominant, but also, of course, muscle memory and coordination. But it also teaches your non-dominant how to be dominant, which in and of itself can be tricky to get used to. Now, the reason why I teach coning up and down is because, especially if you decide you want to start doing this repetitively and really build up your skills, the more clay you start to throw with at one given time, the more you need that non-dominant hand to match your dominant. And therefore, you're going to need to know how to cone up and down in order to successfully center that ball of clay, all right? With smaller amounts of clay, you don't always necessarily need to use the coning up and down method in order to center it, but I always teach it so that you learn all the little things in order to get your hands to work in tandem and support one another, because that's the biggest thing with throwing on the wheel. They are always working in tandem and supporting one another. Now, you want to anchor that ball of clay down to the center of your wheel head, all right? If you drop it or place it off center, and if I turn my wheel head on, as you can tell, trying to put my hands on that ball of clay and keep them on that ball of clay, I'm gonna look like I'm trying to churn butter. And it's gonna be harder for you to successfully center that ball of clay. So you might as well work smarter, not harder, and just slide or pick it up and drop that ball of clay as close as you can to the center. It doesn't need to be perfect, that's what centering is for, but the closer you start out, straight out of the gate, with it eyeballed into the center, the easier centering is going to be, all right? Now, with my non-dominant hand, so my left, on top of that ball of clay, and both hands are completely damp, not just my fingers, I'm gonna turn my wheel head on with my foot pedal, just enough that it spins, so I don't wanna go any faster than that and cause that ball of clay to start sliding or fly off of my wheel. I need a slow wheel speed, both hands damp, and I'm gonna press down firmly with my non-dominant hand on top of that ball without turning it into a pancake in the process. I wanna keep it as close as I can to a ball shape. Now with my dominant index finger down at the bottom, I'm creating a seal. So I am applying a little bit of pressure in my fingertip, not where my nail is, but the muscle in my fingertip, down at the bottom where that ball of clay meets the wheel head to create a seal. I don't want to see any gaps between that ball of clay and my wheel head. That seal is going to help prevent water from getting up underneath it and causing it to slide around or fly off of my wheel when I pick up speed to start centering. Okay. Now, I'm gonna reach into my bucket for more water. You always want more water on your hands than you do clay. It doesn't matter what step you're on, all right? So you will be reaching for water a lot and you'll be scraping a lot of mud off of your hands in the process. You wanna keep that ball of clay looking shiny, but there is such a thing as too much water really quick. You're not trying to turn it into a mud pie. That water is mostly for your hands, it's less for the clay. It's so that the clay is less likely to stick to you as it slides past you. So if it ever gets to a point where it feels like you're throwing a dry paste of mud or sandpaper, especially if you have sand or grog in your clay, reach for water, okay? If you can't see the skin on your hands because they're covered in mud, reach into your bucket, scrape that mud off, get more water on your hands, and get back to work. Now to center that ball of clay, as you can tell, I have an obvious wobble to that ball of clay. That means my clay is not centered. Even the most subtlest wobble is still an indicator that my clay is not centered. If I open that ball of clay before it's fully centered and therefore doesn't have a wobble, it's not uniform as it spins on the wheel, doesn't matter what speed I'm going, doesn't matter what shape it's in. If I open that ball of clay before it's fully centered, I'm gonna have a thick area in my wall, and parallel at that point it's gonna be really thin. Now I can only work with that piece of clay for so long before that thin area in my walls gives out, because it can't support the weight around itself, especially above itself, nor can it support the pressure that I'm applying in my fingers to stretch that clay thinner and taller or wider or both. Okay, so eventually it's gonna get too weak and oversensitive and just collapse. So centering is the hardest step and it is the most crucial step. You wanna reach into your bucket with both hands, turn your wheel head on first before you ever put your hands on that clay, all right? That way you don't accidentally push it off center in the process. For centering, you wanna start with your wheel speed close to a medium speed. Your foot pedal might be adjusted differently, so when you're anchoring, you're at a very low speed, right? Just give it a little bit more. It's better to start off with a little less speed than what you need than too much, all right? Because then it'll be harder for you to re-center it or get it closer to centered. You want to reach into your bucket with both hands and get them wet. You want your knees as close as you can get them to your splash pan, which is that guard around your wheel head. That's going to help out your back a lot. So if you need to scooch forward with your chair or stool or back, that's going to help you out a lot, all right? You want to anchor both elbows to your knees or your thighs, because like I said, this is a balance between tension, pressure, and wheel speed. So tension equals stillness. You'll feel a tightness in your body the more you have. So tension is like making a tight closed fist, but with your hands open, all right? Now to balance that tension, practice making 2 tight closed fists, but with your hands open. That's roughly how much, depending on how much clay you're using, that you're gonna need in both arms to center that ball of clay. Because like I said, tension equals stillness. You wanna make sure you're gonna be less likely to budge when that wobble and that clay hits your hands, okay? So you wanna anchor your elbows so that you can supply enough tension and be as still as possible. You won't be able to do that if your elbows are not connected to your body somehow. Then you wanna anchor both hands to the wheel. Now, even though your fingers are touching the clay for this, when you start to apply pressure, it's not in your fingers yet. As you do this repetitively and you really start to gain that muscle memory and coordination, the tension, the pressure, the balancing with the wheel speed, and the more clay you start to throw, you will, whether you're doing it intentionally or intuitively, you will gently start to use a little bit of pressure in your fingertips, especially right in here, closer to your palm, not the very tip of your finger, to help balance and support the rest of your hand and supply that tension. But for beginners, I always teach to focus on your palms, all right? Because that's where the bulk of that tension and pressure is applied. So don't worry about your fingers. But because all of that tension and pressure is supplied through your palms need to be parallel to one another. Because if they're not, you're making more like a V or an oval with your hands. You're just gonna push that clay even more off center, all right? More than likely. I do have a student that was taught how to center like this, but in my 20 years, I have never seen anybody center with their hands like this. Doesn't mean it's not possible. I've just never been able to successfully do it or see somebody else do it. But like I said, it doesn't mean it's not possible. It doesn't mean it's wrong. But what I am recommending is palms parallel, all right? To help keep your palms parallel, you either want to overlap your fingers so you're making close to a square, and you don't want them to be way out here. You want pretty much a complete overlap with your fingers. Or you can cross your fingers like you're holding your own hands but with your palms open. That will help you keep your palms parallel and focus on your palms with your pressure and your tension. Then you want to slowly start to tense up your arms. Again, that's like making a tight closed fist but with your hands open. When that clay starts to get smoother on the side, obviously it's not going to stop wobbling, but it is going to respond to your tension alone, all right? I'm not applying pressure yet, that's just tightening up my arms, that's tension. When that clay gets smoother on the side, you want to pause that tension. Don't relax it, don't increase it, because that wobble will get worse. Now that it's responding, you want to pause. Hold that tension, and then you're going to slowly start to apply pressure in your palms by slowly bringing your palms toward one another. It's not going to look like you're moving, that's how slowly you're moving. And you want to start with a little bit of pressure at a time until that clay starts to respond to your pressure, all right? Now that clay is going to start moving up towards your thumbs, and that's exactly what you need it to do. When that clay gets to the height of your thumbs, you want to slowly relax that pressure, slowly release it as you slowly slide your hands up to turn that ball into a cone. Now this is part 1 of 2 to centering with the cone up and down method. This is coning up, coning down is part 2. You want to stay at that same wheel speed. Reach for water, anchor your elbows, place your non-dominant palm around the top of that cone from the side. Do not tense up, do not apply pressure and squeeze that clay in. Just relax it, giving it a gentle hug. Where your dominant fist, I'm going to use the muscle on the side of my palm, not my pinky, and I'm going to slowly start to apply pressure from the center or the radius of the pinnacle of that cone. So from the center over, I'm going to slowly start to apply pressure, pushing that cone down, a little bit of pressure at a time. Now, as my dominant fist pushes that clay down, my non-dominant on the side needs to gently and gradually tense up to direct that clay into the center. Both hands are moving down, they stay connected, not one hand moving faster than the other, all right? So it's a gradual motion, slow motion, and then you're gonna cone up and down again, because as you can tell, I still have at least a subtle wobble in that ball of clay. Now, I'm gonna do it one more time, but explain it in different words. Like I said earlier, you always want your wheel speed set first. I recommend starting at a slightly slower speed. So your foot pedal close to parallel to the floor, or maybe your heel slightly closer to the floor, depending on how your foot pedal is adjusted with its speed settings. It's better to start off a little slow, and you can slowly increase it if you need more, because there is such a thing as too little and too much of either of those three factors: speed, tension, pressure. So anchor your elbows, anchor your hands to the wheel. Make sure both hands are completely wet, not just your fingers. Overlap your fingers or cross them to help keep your palms parallel. Slowly tense up. Again, that's like making a tight closed fist, but with your hands open, and you want it to be a slow build up until you feel that clay get a little bit smoother on the side, and when it does, pause it. Don't increase it, don't decrease it. Or relax it, rather. Now, then you're gonna slowly start to apply pressure at the widest point of that ball of clay, which is typically at the bottom, where it's anchored to the wheel. So wherever your widest point is, that's the first place you wanna gently start to apply pressure. So mine is at the bottom where it's anchored to the wheel, so I'm gonna slowly start to apply pressure in this muscle in both palms, where it's anchored to the bottom. But I don't wanna keep adding pressure in that same area, because eventually I'm just gonna take that whole ball of clay off. You see that? So that brings me back to what I noted at the very beginning when I said you're learning how to intuitively respond to the clay as it responds to you. So when you start to apply pressure slowly, and that clay starts to respond to that pressure, you then want to gently adjust your pressure point as that clay starts to respond and it starts to move up. So again, I'm gonna start pressure right here, and these muscles in my palm. The bottom's gonna move in, the rest is gonna move up a little bit. I'm then gonna relax pressure here in both palms and gently lean in with the center part of my palms where this belly is starting to form in the center of that ball. So I'm gonna back off pressure here and lean in with the center. So as that clay starts to move up, you'll gently move in or veer in with your palms so that you can adjust that pressure point, but it's not gonna look like you're moving. The top half just moved up a little bit, and now that the top of that ball of clay has reached this muscle up underneath both thumbs, that's my next pressure point. Now I'm not trying to move as much clay as when I started at the bottom, so it's a little less pressure than when I initially started adding pressure down at the bottom. The top is now reaching the height of my thumbs. Now I slowly lift both hands off the wheel, and I slowly release that pressure as I slowly slide my hands up. That way I don't yank a huge chunk of that cone off or the whole thing. If it starts to slide around or you disconnect that ball of clay from the wheel, that's too much pressure. So you either want to relax that pressure at least a little bit, and you might want to also consider giving it a little bit more wheel speed, especially if you're definitely going a slow wheel speed straight out of the gate, to balance those two out. Now, to reiterate how slowly you want to slide your hands up when you're coning up. You want one full revolution, at least one full revolution of that clay, regardless of what wheel speed you're going, regardless of where your hands are placed. That's how slowly you want to slide your hands up. That way you keep that clay uniform all the way around. If you move too fast, you're going to push that clay even more off center, just like that. Okay, so slow and steady. Moving and releasing that pressure. Okay, reach for water to cone back down, same wheel speed. Your non-dominant hand's going to gently hug the top of that cone from the side, because if it's any lower than that point and your dominant fist is applying pressure in that side of your palm, it's not supported where you're trying to apply that pressure, and you're going to be more inclined to slide around, whether you're doing a karate chop method, which isn't wrong either, or a flat hand on top. I always suggest closing your dominant fist to push down for several reasons. What I learned in doing a karate chop method is I'm more inclined to slide because I don't have tension locked. If I close my fist, I know I have at least a little bit of tension locked in my fist. all right? So I'm less likely to slide around. When I used to do a flat hand on top, I can't see what the clay is doing. So it was difficult for me as a beginner to learn how to respond to that clay if I couldn't see it. So for beginners, I recommend, the other reason why I don't do a flat hand on top is I'm more inclined to start creating a flare at the top, and that clay is just gonna fly off eventually and I'll lose it, and I need that clay, right? So I recommend that you gently apply a little bit of pressure along the radius and the side of your palm. Do not pivot your wrist. Hold it at a hard angle. Watch what you're doing. Gently apply a little bit of pressure at a time. When that clay starts to move down, gently start to apply a little bit of tension at a time, a gradual increase in your non-dominant hand as you start to feel that clay want to wobble again. And then once your hands meet the wheel, pause, hold that tension in your non-dominant hand, especially to help direct where it's anchored into the center, because that's the hardest place to center. If you get a big flare developing along your bat and up underneath your hands when they're anchored to the wheel, scrape all of that off, let it fly away, reach for water. Now if you have coned up and down several times and you still have at least a subtle wobble, or you're having a hard time getting the hang of it and you feel like coning up and down is just making it worse, stay in the position of coning down, all right? Reach for water, stay at the same wheel speed. So your non-dominant hand nestled on the side, your dominant fist nestled on top. Do not keep applying pressure with your dominant fist on top. This is gonna help train your non-dominant arm the tension and pressure it needs to get a response out of that clay. This will also help you get that last wobble out of that ball of clay, especially if it's due to an air bubble, which is a huge reason why centering is so important, is you're trying to work out any air bubbles that's causing it to be off center in the first place. All right. Now, if I push in at the bottom, again, that's this muscle right here, until I make a small groove at the bottom. I don't want to apply too much pressure. And then I'm going to adjust my pressure point and lean back with where I just applied pressure down at the bottom and apply pressure with that muscle up underneath my thumb at the top. It's going to push that clay down. Now this tactic of slowly pivoting my non-dominant arm, or hand rather, is going to work out that last wobble, especially if it's due to a trapped air bubble. That air bubble is going to work its way up to the surface, and as it comes up to the top, it's going to hit my dominant hand that's just hanging out upstairs, and it's going to pop. Odds are you're probably not going to see that air bubble, but you'll feel it, and then it should pop and it'll be gone, and that ball of clay should be centered. Now another important tip, doesn't matter what step you're on, but especially for centering, when you need to reach for water, like I said, you're doing it a lot, you want to slowly relax your hands and slowly remove them. That way when you do remove your hands, you don't accidentally push that clay off center in the process. Now a lot of times when that wobble is so subtle, if you just keep still and apply enough tension, sometimes it may not be very much. Sometimes, depending on how stiff or soft that clay is, especially if it's on the stiffer side, you need more tension to stay still. And that tension alone will take that wobble out, especially when you're so close to being centered. Now if it starts to get worse, relax that tension, and any pressure you have in your hands, that's where the sweet spot is. And that ball of clay should be centered after that. Now once your clay is centered, you want to slow down a little bit, because you're about to open that ball of clay, and you're only going to use 1 to 2 fingers to do that, so you don't want to be going too fast and push that clay off center in the process. Reach for water with both hands. Nestle your non-dominant hand, giving it a gentle hug. Keep your elbows anchored. You want to lock your thumbs together somehow, whether that's wrapping them around each other like so, or what I typically do is lock my dominant thumb behind my non-dominant. It's an anchor. Now that anchor is going to help prevent your dominant hand from slipping and sliding or moving too fast, or accidentally hooking your finger and pushing that clay off center in the process while you're opening it. All right, so another reason why you want to slow your wheel speed. So you want to bring your heel a little bit closer to the floor. Lock your thumb. Use the muscle in your fingertip, not the very tip of your finger where your nail is, because even if you're like me and you don't have nails at all, your nails will still catch on that clay. And you'll push it off center in the process and possibly make a hole or a big gash in that clay. Now, just lay your finger perpendicular to the center of the top of that ball of clay. With that muscle in your fingertip and the top center of that ball, slowly start to push down. And as you start to push your fingertip straight down towards the wheel head, you're gonna start to form close to a 90-degree angle with your finger. You wanna push down until you think you're close to the bottom, but without going all the way through, all right? When you think you're close to the bottom, pause that position of your finger. Do not hook it, all right? Don't change the position of your finger, just pause. You're not gonna push down anymore. You're gonna slowly push towards you, and again, it's not gonna look like you're moving. That's how slow you are moving. So from the center, you're now gonna push that clay, again, with the muscle in your fingertip. You're gonna push that clay very slowly towards you to open that hole up wider. But you don't wanna just keep stretching it and stretching it, because where you're applying that pressure, which is now the bottom half of your wall, if you just keep stretching that clay, eventually where you're applying that pressure is gonna get way too thin, and you're just gonna take all that clay off and be left with a coaster attached to the wheel, all right? So when you have a few inches in diameter at the bottom of your piece, so 2 to 3 inches, all right? Pause that position of your finger again, stop pushing out, just relax that pressure, but slowly slide your fingertip up that wall to your rim to help straighten that interior wall out. That way it's no longer top heavy. It's okay if your wall gradually gets thicker as it gets closer to the bottom, the base, also known as your foot, because everything at the bottom needs to be able to support the weight above itself. You just don't want the other way around and have it top heavy, all right? Now, I recommend you grab your sponge, use it on the inside to get all of that water out of your piece, and make sure that your base is level, all right? So if you have a belly button in the center or a spiral or a hump somewhere, use that sponge to cover your fingertips, hold your hand steady from the center, slowly and gently direct that clay towards your wall, and it'll smooth all of that out, all right? You want it to be as smooth and level as possible all the way around. Because what I also teach all of my beginners, until you learn depth perception and thickness perception, that handy dandy needle tool, which potters never seem to have enough of, as well as sponges, you want to use that to test the thickness of your base before you move forward. Because as you keep applying water and tension and pressure, especially pressure at this point, you're going to stretch that clay thinner, wetter, because you're keep working with water, and eventually your piece is going to get very sensitive to your touch. So it's better to test this now before your piece gets way too sensitive, and you can fix it, all right? Now, you want to hold that needle tool upside down, make sure your wheel head's off, place that needle all the way through your base. With your finger pointed down, grab a hold of it until your fingertip touches your base, pull that out, and that's your thickness gauge. Now for beginners, I recommend that you aim for about a 1/2 inch, right? Like I said at the beginning, I'm not focused on making something specific yet. That's gonna be in a different video or multiple different videos. For now, just going over the foundations, aim for about a 1/2 inch, which is exactly where I'm at, all right? If you're much thicker than that, you're gonna have to learn how to trim or remove a good amount of clay from the bottom so that your piece doesn't explode when it's getting fired, all right? And looks and touch don't deceive you on whether or not it's dry or not. So if it's much thinner than a 1/2 inch, because of how you have to cut your piece off the wheel when you're done throwing it, you will more than likely tear through it or really close. And it'll be very, if you don't tear through it, it'll have greater chances of cracking while your piece is drying, all right? whether it's drying or even if it doesn't crack during the drying process, it'll more than likely crack during the firing processes. So aim for about a 1/2 inch. Now, if your base is much thicker than a 1/2 inch right now, you can easily repeat that opening process, but with a little less pressure in your fingertip because you're not trying to push through as much clay. All right, so when you see a small ring of clay form around your fingertip by gently pushing down in the center, you can gently push that ring of clay towards your wall again, repeating that opening process, and that'll give you a little bit more clay to work with, as well as ultimately a little bit more volume in your finished piece, regardless of what you end up making right now. So once your base is a good thickness, use your sponge to just gently go over that hole. You don't need to apply pressure. That sponge will just gently smear some mud back into that hole, which you probably don't want there anyway. Now, I need to compress my rim after opening and in between each pull of my walls, which is next. Because your rim is front and center, you're more than likely touching it the most, whether you realize it or not. So it's the first place that's going to want to be the weakest link. It's either going to start to split apart and tear from itself because you forgot to compress it, or it's going to get too thin from all that pressure that you forgot to release while you're bringing up your walls, which is the next step. And it's going to either start to buckle or it's going to flat out collapse and fold over. All right, so you want to keep it nice and strong. Make sure both hands are wet. You are going to place your non-dominant index and thumb, make a U, on each side of your rim. Do not pinch, do not apply pressure, not even a little bit. They are there to support each side of your wall while your dominant index finger gently comes in and makes an A with it. It's going to nestle on top of that rim and gently push that rim down until your rim is at least an even thickness with the clay below itself. You can make it slightly thicker like I am mine, but again, you don't want to end up making it top heavy. So, reach for water, stay at a slow wheel speed. You're going to stay at a slow wheel speed from here on out. So if you feel like you keep gradually and incidentally increasing or decreasing your wheel speed, take your foot off that pedal. Your wheel head will still spin, okay? You're welcome. Reach for water. Now, if you're righty, you want your left on the inside, your right on the outside. In other words, you want both hands on the right-hand side of your piece at 3 o'clock of your wheel head. If you're lefty, unless you're throwing ambidextrous, you want both hands on the left-hand side at 9 o'clock. Your right hand's on the inside, your left hand's on the outside. You're still using the muscles in your fingertips, not the very tip of your finger. The reason why I suggest that, because that's another one of those little things that not everybody teaches the same. Doesn't mean we're wrong. What I have found, even though I don't have nails at all, if I use the very tip of my fingers without holding a sponge in my hands to hold or to cover my nails, I'm just going to scratch a bunch of clay off in the process when I try and make my pieces taller and thinner, but I need that clay, right? So that's one. And two, by holding my sponge in my hand, or at least one hand, which I do in my right hand, my dominant, I can have a little bit of water in there and I'm less likely to run out of water by the time I get to my rim, which can also cause your rim to start to buckle on itself, all right? So, you want to use the muscle in your fingertips. You want your non-dominant hand on the inside, all the way at the bottom where the wall meets the base. Gently push out a little bit at a time. It's not going to take much. Nowhere nearly as much as when you're centering. Gently push out until you see or feel that clay start to move into your dominant hand, which is slightly lower than directly parallel on the outside of your piece. So, but just like coning up, when you see or feel that clay move into your dominant hand on the outside of your piece, you're going to gently match that little bit of clay. Slowly slide your hands up and slowly release that little bit of pressure from your fingertips. That way you don't accidentally cause that clay to buckle or accidentally hook your fingers and push it off center in the process. That would be sad, especially as a beginner. Don't forget to compress your rim. If clay flies off, just let it. Reach for water. And do it again, but you're going to use less pressure in your fingertips because you just stretched that clay a little bit thinner. You've worked water into it. Now push out with your non-dominant on the inside, back in with your dominant on the outside. Slowly slide both hands up, slowly release your pressure. Compress your rim. Now after, especially once you've done this in repetition a lot, as you gain the skills that work best for you to do this successfully, after a few pull of your walls, if you continue to do any pulls of your walls, by the time you get halfway and continue up, maybe a little taller than halfway, by the time you get up to your rim, you're not really using pressure. You've released it all. It's just supporting that wall to make sure it's all consistent and even. Now, as I noted earlier, your fingers are not directly parallel like when you are coning up, right, to center. Technically, your non-dominant hand that's on the inside is slightly above your dominant that's on the outside because of that layer of clay that you have at your base, all right? And that actually needs to be the case for you to successfully bring that clay up and make your wall taller and thinner. Because otherwise, if they are directly parallel, that clay is just going to stay put. It's not going to go anywhere. Just a reminder, you want to gently release that pressure as you slowly slide your hands up. So not one hand moving faster than the other, because you're not bringing up nearly as much clay as when you started at the bottom. And again, just like coning up, if you move your hands too fast, you're just going to push that clay off center or make a fun tornado shape, swirly pattern. Now, if you want a straight cylinder like so, you want to have equal amounts of pressure in both hands while you bring up your walls. Compress your rim. At this point, when I compress my rim, it's mostly touch. It's not about pressure. It's just making sure I'm not leaving a bunch of mud or water on there, which can also cause it to collapse or start to split apart. Now, if you want your piece to get wider at any point, you want to have most, if not all, of your pressure in your non-dominant hand, because your non-dominant hand is on the inside pushing the clay out. And if you want your piece to get narrower at any point, you can shift gears and have most, if not all, of your pressure in your dominant hand, because your dominant hand is on the outside directing that clay back in. You do not want to let water just build up and hang out on the inside of your piece while you're still throwing, or especially after you cut that piece off the wheel. So that sponge is your best friend. You use it a lot, because that water will cause, at the very least, your piece to start to split apart from itself and crack, especially when it's drying. Or if you're still throwing, it can cause down here to get too weak and wet and cause your piece to collapse while you're trying to finish it. So, don't do that. Now, to refine this, you can use what's called a rib tool. Now, these come in all different shapes and sizes. This is wood, which has zero flexibility. Metal and polymer ones have different thicknesses or levels of flexibility, especially polymer or plastic ones. Metals are typically very flexible. Now, if I want to smooth this vessel, I can use my wooden one first, especially to shave off this flare of extra clay down at the bottom. Now to shave that flare of extra clay, it's not about applying pressure through a tool. If I'm just cleaning up that bottom so I don't have a split and jagged edge when I flip this over later after the clay sets up to trim that foot, which is what your base is called, I like to use a wooden tool, whether it's the tapered end of that wooden knife tool, because it's got a curved end with 2 different sides as well, or a wooden rib. That hole in that rib is so that your thumb and index finger get a nice firm grip on it, okay? I'm gonna dip it in my bucket so that this doesn't snag my piece when I bring it up to the surface. I'm gonna plant the long straight edge on the wheel and bring this corner up to my foot. It's already following that curve of that foot. So, especially if I wanna keep that curve, just not as much clay there, I can use this by gently bringing that curve of the tool up to that foot and letting it scrape a little bit of that clay off. It's not gonna take much pressure. That's why I slide it, or I place it on my wheel and slowly slide it up to my piece until it reaches the curve that I already have down there. And it'll just gently shave off a little bit at a time. Now, unless I want to change the shape of my piece, do I apply a little bit of pressure through a tool. But if I'm just smoothing it and refining it, I'm going to use the curved side of this rib tool. I'm going to repeat that process I did earlier, planting the long straight edge on my wheel, bringing that corner up to my base. It's already following that curve that I have at that foot. And now I'm going to lift the short end off the wheel so that the curve of the tool starts to follow that curve of the bottom half of this vessel. And again, I don't apply pressure through a tool unless I want to change the shape. So I am leaving the tip of that tool applied to the wheel head so that I'm less likely to move too fast or apply pressure. It's leaving it anchored. I'm going to flip this over so that as I come up over that belly and approach the neck and the rim, the curve of the tool is already following the curve of that neck and rim and the top part of the belly. Now I can also use this tool to shape and compress my rim. Doesn't matter which side, but especially if I want a bevel or a flat rim, I can gently change the angle of that rib tool and make a bevel. Now if I want to accentuate the flare of that rim, I can use the curved side on the inside of that neck. It's going to smooth that out and gently direct the inside of that rim out. It's less about pressure and more or less about just subtly and gently changing the angle of that tool. Now, once I'm happy with my piece, especially if I have water in there, I want to get all that loose water out of there, gently go over my rim, my lip. I like to fold my sponge over my lip. If you have a texture you don't want and you want to smooth that out, you can use your sponge to do that. Now if I wanted to remove even more of that clay down at the bottom, I can use the tapered end of that wooden knife by holding it like a pencil and aligning that taper with the angle at the bottom half of that wall. Slowly sliding it down until the tip of that tool meets the wheel head. That's going to cut another flare of clay off of my base, and I can clean that off, dip it in water, and bring it back to that flare. It's going to split that apart. I can turn my wheel head off, get rid of that. Clean off any boogers with that tool. Clean it off. Bring it back up to the surface. And if I want to or need to, I can gently go over that area with my sponge. You can refine as much as you would like to finesse that piece, but just keep in mind that clay is very sensitive right now. So it's just about touch. Now, to cut my piece off the wheel, especially for beginners, I recommend not spinning your wheel because it might freak you out if your piece starts to glide, all right? So until you feel confidence, doesn't matter what level of confidence, but until you've done this multiple times and you feel okay about turning your wheel head on just a very slow speed, you want to grab your wire tool. Now, if it's really obnoxiously long like mine, wrap it around one or both of your hands like it's dental floss. You want to hold it nice and tight. Use your thumbs to plant it in the north position of your wheel. Slowly slide it up underneath your piece. Do not lift until you feel that tension release out from underneath your piece. That way you don't accidentally cut your base at an angle and have it end up being lopsided and harder for you to trim it later. Now, I always recommend to cut it several times just because your piece is so wet at this point, it'll easily glue itself right back down to the wheel. So to minimize any struggle of picking your piece up, if you're not going to leave it on the bat, cut it with the wire tool multiple times. Dry your hands off. They don't need to be perfectly clean or dry, but you don't want them covered in water or mud and then try and pick your wet piece up and have it slide around and deform it or just drop it. Now, give it a gentle hug around the bottom. Your hands don't need to completely wrap around it, but bring your fingers as close as you can to each other. Lift the north end towards you. It should gently and easily lift from the bat. Then use your palms to lift it up. Put it on a wear board. Give it a gentle hug if you need to. Clay has memory, so it'll easily take its form back. Clean up your wheel and make another one. Have fun. I hope this was helpful for you. At least one little tactic. Like I said, everybody throws differently. So it's always helpful to observe, watch, learn from other people, whether you're taking a class or a workshop or just watching videos. But have fun, because that's why we all try this out, right? All right,